Good evening. This is Brooke Baker, the Assistant Director of Finance and Operations, and welcome to the final budget presentation for the 2023-2024 school year. During tonight's agenda, we will take you through the budget calendar and timeline. We will present the revenue and expenditure details, review the district's tax information and the impact to the taxpayers, and lastly, we'll go over our long-term projections before summarizing and returning to our Finance Committee meeting. The budget calendar is driven by dates established by Act 1 of 2006. The two main objectives of this legislation were to limit the rate of annual property tax increases by school districts to a cost of living index and to provide direct property tax relief to homeowners with gambling revenue. Here are some important dates for the taxpayer to receive that tax relief. Applications are mailed out to homeowners by December 31st of each year by the Allegheny County Assessment Office. They are due back to the assessment office by March 1st of each year to be applicable for that year's tax rebate effective for July 1st. By May 1st, the Pennsylvania Department of Education notifies the district of the amount of their state allocation of property tax reduction funding. The district then applies that tax relief on the tax bills that are mailed for July 1st of each year. The district starts its budget calendar following these dates as well in the timeline set by Act 1. We first received notification of the cost of living index for the upcoming budget year by September 30th. For the 23-24 school year, that inflationary index is 4.1%, which the district cannot raise taxes above without seeking the voter referendum. Shortly after receiving our index, we started our budget calendar and the Finance Committee started the preparation for the 23-24 budget. On January 10th, the Finance Committee met and reviewed a structural budget to ensure the district did not exceed the 4.1% index set by the state. On January 17th, we passed a resolution guaranteeing the district would not exceed the index for the 23-24 budget year. The other option would be if we needed to go above the index, we would need to pass what is called a preliminary budget and then move into the proposed final and final budget stages. Since we passed a resolution on January 17th to not exceed the index, we immediately moved into preparation of our proposed final budget, which was presented and adopted on April 18th. Lastly, we're here tonight to present the final budget, with the final budget to be adopted on May 23rd. At this time, I'll turn it over to Mr. Antoline.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Let's start with taking a look at the 2023-2024 final budget summary, which projects expenditures of $58,254,014. You will see on this chart that aligns to the steps that Brooke just outlined. In January, we presented a preliminary revenue budget in order to determine whether we would be able to stay under that Act 1 inflationary index that she outlined, which for next year is 4.1%. Fortunately, we were able to adopt a resolution to guarantee that we would be able to stay under that index. In February and March, we provided the board and public with information relative to the cost drivers, revenue trends, and various budget components. And last month, prepared and presented a proposed final budget. And of course, we are here today in May to present the final revenue budget, which I am outlining at the $58 million, which does include a 2.9% or 5.5910 mil increase to the millage, which is under that 4.1% Act 1 index, and also is less than the original projected 3.4% increase we projected in the preliminary budget back in January. Okay, so let's start with the projected revenues. You will see on this pie chart that Quaker Valley is extremely dependent on local tax base, with over 82% of our revenues coming from local sources. I will go over some of the factors that determine the reliance on local taxes in future slide, but let's first take a detailed look at the revenue line items. And here are the line item details for the local revenue budget. Highlighted in yellow are the real estate line items, and highlighted in orange are the earned income tax line items. These two revenue sources make up approximately 79% of the total budget. And we do follow these trends on a monthly basis for these two critical components for funding our educational programs. All the other local sources listed make up approximately 3.5% of our total budget. I will go over the real estate and earned income, but would like to note you will see for interest earnings in the middle of the chart, there is a significant increase in the projection for the 23-24 budget relative to the current market conditions and inflationary rates that are driving the federal interest rates up. So our largest tax revenue base is our real estate taxes. So in the first column on this report, you will note our budgeted assessment history, and that is what drives, the revenue number and helps us determine what tax rate is necessary to fund all of our expenditure line items. You will see for 23-24, we have a budgeted assessment of slightly over $2 million. And if you look at the most recent history, you will see that real estate assessment growth has been strong, over 1% with a little dip in 23-24. We will talk later about long-term revenue projections and where we determine that need for what we utilize as the budgeted assessment and the tax rate is for those future projections as well. But this is the basis for the line items that we just went over. I also wanted to show on this chart and tie into the individual homeowners for the Act 1 property tax relief, what that will look like relative to funding from the state. So we will talk about, state revenues here shortly, but the line item, that the state does provide in the form of property tax relief is in 23-24 projecting giving the district $844,000 to pass back to the taxpayers in the form of a homestead exclusion on the tax bill, which results in a property tax reduction. So this property tax reduction is for all approved homesteads. And as Brooke mentioned in the introduction to the presentation and the timeline relative to Act 1 in the Property Tax Relief Act, those applications must be submitted by the homeowner by March 1st before the tax year. And we receive a listing of May 1st of all of those approved. So for the 23-24 school year, we have 3,611 parcels that have been approved for the homestead exclusion, and that amount of the taxpayer reduction will equate to $233.87 back to those approved homestead. So, and you will see on the chart that approved taxpayer reduction amount highlighted in yellow that was typically in that $180 range, did increase last year. And it is in direct relationship to the amount of funding the state provided, which was from gaming revenues in the state and the calculation. So a significant increase in 22-23 resulted in property approved homestead property owners receiving approximately $50 more back in the form of a tax exclusion credit on the tax bill. And that carried into 23-24. We were happy that we were able to reach those same levels to pass this back to the taxpayer. So the next big revenue driver is the earned income tax. And so here is a detail of that second largest revenue source starting in 2015-16 to the current budget year. So you will see a progression in those collections, through 19-20. And what we all know that happened in 2020 relative to the pandemic is the economic slowdown and including, wages earned and the resulting taxes did go down in that year. However, we did see that rebound in 21-22. And when we have dug into those details, we were able to assess that it was not necessarily a lack of or a decrease in earned income for that 2020-21 year. We had a lot of taxpayers, and both for earned income and even federal taxes that were, paying late or drawing out payments relative to, potential pauses in the economy. So really some of this collection in 21-22 at that $5.6 million can be attributed to that 2020-2021 wage base year. And as you'll see in 22-23, and we discussed earlier in the meeting, we are projecting, revenues of approximately $5.4 million, which is the basis for what we built the 23-24 budget on, which totals $5.6 million to show an increase in, wages in the 23-24 year. So as I said, if we attribute some of that 21-22 to 2020, you will really see a blending all the way up of a pretty steady increase in wages and a steady tax base with that revenue source. Okay, so let's take a look at the state revenues. which are comprised of direct subsidies, grants, and other specific expense reimbursement that the state provides. Highlighted in orange are the subsidies for basic and special education, and highlighted in yellow is the property tax relief funding that we outlined a few slides already. The total state revenues make up 16% of our overall budget. Worth pointing out is the basic ed subsidy line at the top of the page. You will see from 2021 to 21-22, there was growth in that line item from 1.5 to 1.7 million. And then again from 21-22 to 22-23, and the actual for 22-23 is now projected to come in at 2.1 million. So after several years of flat to moderate funding on that basic education line, we are seeing rises in the amount that the state is providing, from the governor's budget approval. For 23-24, it is worth noting the governor's budget does include, significant funding for Pennsylvania schools. We are conservative as that budget has not been passed and won't be passed until probably in June, and projecting a moderate increase in that basic ed subsidy line. So a conservative approach, and we anticipate that although we don't anticipate the governor's budget being approved as proposed, we do believe that that line item will be increased again after several years of flat funding. So strong increase for basic ed subsidy, but obviously a small portion of our overall budget, as we described, that we are heavily reliant on local taxes. So the state does use financial aid ratios and other school-specific demographic information to determine how much of the state education funding pot, whether it's subsidies or reimbursement, goes back to each individual school district. You will see on this chart for all Allegheny schools where I just list some of those aid ratio indicators for market value, personal income, which shows that QVSD has the lowest aid ratios in the county. And that translates to that dependence on local taxation that I spoke about. Also interesting to note that districts with higher aid ratios get an adjustment to their Act 1 inflationary index. So as I noted, QV's index is 4.1% for the 23-24 school year, but you will see on this chart that others, such as Moon, which is right across the river, are able to raise taxes up to 4.9% for according to the Act 1 index. Next is a quick outline of our federal revenues for our 23-24 budget. Although a small portion of our budget, they fund important federal programs for math, reading, and class size reduction. Our access funding provides resources for our special education department, critical for those programs. But the one I wanted to highlight, which is highlighted in orange, is a line for pandemic relief funding that we have received or are budgeting to receive since 2020. This listing gives you details of the various acts that provided this assistance to school districts. We have received most of this funding, but the last one listed under the American Rescue Plan will provide some funding into the 23-24 year that was shown on the previous slide. We were fortunate to receive these funds that help support a few years of no tax increase, but our long-term planning that I will overview later does not project this extra assistance to continue. Okay, let's shift from revenues to expenditures and take a quick look at this pie chart to see where the budget money goes. Salary and benefits, an investment in our people, are approximately 67% of our total budget, followed by debt service for capital investments in all of our facilities at 11% and transportation at 4%. We will show in upcoming slides a breakdown of budget categories and department budgets and go over some of the cost drivers associated with all of this information in the pie chart. As we take a look at the expenditure budget summary and a breakdown of those budget categories and departments, you will see the large expenditure items on the first few lines, including salary and benefits, which makes up 67%, which is expected to rise approximately 4.4% in the 23-24 school year. This is attributable to about a 3.25% increase in contracted salaries, plus a 14% increase in healthcare benefits. Also included in the benefits line are pension payments to PESERS, which is the Pennsylvania School Employees Retirement System, and we will take a deeper dive into these payments a little later in the presentation. Okay, and then after salary and benefits, we have debt service and fund transfers. These two lines we have been talking about frequently as it relates to funding of the high school project and building capacity for that debt service related to that project. So the fund transfer line, you will see an investment increase of approximately $825,000, and that fund transfer is intended to move into our capital projects fund, and this will align and tie into our 5-year capital planning process, which we will present in June with Mr. Goche, to fund all of the capital projects for the next 5 years related to all of facilities. And you will see, I will talk later in the presentation about a 5-year budget plan, and you will see the shifting from fund transfers into debt service as we engage and borrow money relative to that high school project. So these two line items are go in hand together to ensure not only the high school project funding, but that our current facilities are taken care of. So most of the other budget categories and department breakdowns, you will see inflationary increases of 1 to 3%. But there are two other categories that I would make note on are the charter school tuition line, that you will see about a 13% decrease. We will touch base on that and outline that in some future slides, as that's always been a large cost driver for the district. And the second one is down under building utilities, which we will see a 14% budgeted increase. And probably understandable to all, as we've seen these inflationary pressures, hitting households with gas and electric bills, on the rise. We do anticipate and hope that there is a leveling off in 2024, but the budget does reflect a 14% increase in that category. So let's take a closer look at some of the large cost drivers and unfunded or underfunded mandates, where we are required to provide certain services and benefits by legislation with little or no funding support from the state or federal level that approve such legislation. First, for pension payments to the school employees retirement system, they have risen significantly over the last 14 years to now equal 14% of our total budget. These payments would represent over 35% of the tax increase since 2014 and 15 in and of itself. For special education costs, which represent 12% of our total budget, we are going to take a look at how state and federal funding cover less than 30% of those direct costs associated with providing services to our special education students. We will also look at charter school payments, as we have talked significantly about the outdated and unfair funding formula, where we pay $19,000 for regular ed students and twice that for special education students who choose to go to charter schools, with no direct funding from the state to offset those costs. There are many ongoing legislative requirements that are proposed and implemented that really require the schools to do more with less. We are active in advocacy to protect the school's interests and ask for more funding from the state and federal levels. And we ask that our constituents also pay close attention to these and support the school in their endeavors to get fair and equitable funding for schools. So here is a chart of the historical costs of those PSERS pension obligations. You will see from 2012-13 to the current year, 2022-23, costs have risen from $2 million a year to almost $8 million a year for this pension cost, with future cost obligations projected to be over $10 million in the 29-30 year. So if we take a look at more details related to these historical PSERS costs and look at the contribution rates that drive it, they are listed in the second column, and they are the percentage is applied to our total eligible salaries for a given year to come up with the district actual cost. It is worth noting that the state does actually reimburse 50% of this actual cost. And you saw that back when we went over the state revenues, there was a line item, for that reimbursement level. So the net increase to the district is shown in the last column. That was a direct expenditure hit for each year for the district that contributed to those tax increases, as I mentioned, from 14-15 to current, represented over 35% of the tax increase. So another area where state and federal funding is not keeping up with expenditures is special education, where we are required to provide services to students as prescribed in their individualized education plan. So this chart just shows those growing levels of expenditures in green that are significantly higher than the total state and federal funding for such expenses layered in blue, red, and purple, a significant gap that we must fund with local tax dollars. And then taking a look at charter school cost versus funding, this is a graphical representation of what that expense was for the district starting in 2011-12 to the current year projections. You will note at the bottom of the chart in red is a line that represents the charter subsidy amounts we receive from the state and federal government, which is currently zero. Interesting to note is that 2010, 11, and prior, the state did provide approximately 30% in reimbursement for this expense line item. We have been fortunate at Quaker Valley that this line item has been generally flat and stable for us, with the exception, of course, of the 2021, 21, 22 spike years relative to the pandemic, where we did see more students choosing cyber charter schools for their educational choice. However, the point here is that we can't control who chooses charter schools or not, and we must foot the bill 100% locally as the state took away its funding source back in 2010, 2011. So as a recap of the expenditure budget, salary and benefits alone represent 67% of the total budget. Unfunded and underfunded mandates continue to drive the local tax burden. The budget includes set-asides for the upcoming high school project as we develop long-term plans to manage the debt load associated with significant capital improvements. We will take a look at some of those long-term projections in a minute, but let's first look at our current local tax effort that is the primary source to pay for the expenditure budget. We do understand that paying for our investment in education comes primarily from local tax effort. However, QV ranks in the bottom third for lowest millage rate in Allegheny County. There also is an equalized millage metric that expresses tax rates as a percentage of market value. It is used to provide realistic comparisons of actual market value taxing efforts across district lines. Generally, high equalized mills represents a higher tax burden than low equalized mills, and QV ranks in the lowest quartile when comparing equalized taxing efforts as well. So just showing that taxing effort on a comparative data chart, here's where Quaker Valley, highlighted in yellow, ranks among its Allegheny County peers relative to tax rate and millage and equalized mills. So we remain near the bottom in Allegheny County relative to our tax level and tax effort. Now that we have reviewed the details and factors associated with the one-year snapshot for 2023-2024, let's take a look at some long-term budget projections. It is important to note that these long-term projections include both operational and financing costs associated with the new high school. They include the capital needs of all of our current facilities, as well as expenditures needed to maintain our high-performing school programs and services. Our strategic long-term planning ensures that we have sight to paying for the significant investment of a new high school without crowding out the funds necessary to maintain existing buildings and educational programs. So let's take a look at those long-term budget projections for expenditures. These projections do include cost of living increases and historical trends in all departments and cost centers, but I would like to highlight just a few areas associated with the high school project. So let's start with the two line items of debt service and fund transfers that we discussed when going over the Snapshot 23-24 budget. These two line items are where we are building the capacity to pay for all the capital needs of the district and transition to the debt service associated with the new high school. As discussed, and as we do every year, Mr. Gauthier will present a capital plan to address all the needs for all of our buildings over the next 5 years. We anticipate this capital plan to be fully funded and thus the progression to the debt service line associated with the school opening in 2027. Of course, the amounts on these two lines may shift depending on exactly when we borrow the money relative to the project timeline, cash flow needs, market rates, etc., but it shows a base projection of where the total debt service is likely to land. The next two lines to discuss are those for facilities and building utilities. You will see a progression of expense in these two categories relative to the increased square footage that is associated with the new high school versus our current facility. The next line down for transportation includes funding for any shuttle runs from the new high school to the existing stadium facility. So here are the long-term budget projections for revenues necessary to fund these expenditure projections. As we know, the majority of funding for our budgets comes from local real estate taxes. These 5-year projections do include tax increases in the 2.9 to 3.4% range, and also include some conservative assessment growth projections relative to that line item. On the next slide, we will show actual millage rates associated with these increases and discuss the impact to taxpayers. All other revenue categories are projected based on historical trends, with the exception of a few. One being under federal sources. We talked about the pandemic funding acts that were in place to assist schools with pandemic-related expenditures. You will note on that line item, as discussed previously, that we are not planning for any of that funding level to continue into the 24-25 year or future. And what we typically see with new schools is an increase in community and private use, which increases the rental income activity reflected in the rentals line under local revenues. But again, the main line in current and future budgets is the real estate tax line. So let's take a look at those millage rate impacts. Here are the long-term budget projections in the form of the millage rate. Nothing new here, as we have been posting these long-term millage projections every year since June of 2020 and updating according to current budget trends and project estimates, which currently are in the 98 to 99 million range at the design development phase. This chart lists the projected millage rates that taxpayers could use to calculate their tax bills over the next several years. I have also included a historical look at both the tax rate and the Act 1 inflationary index to note our district trends. You will see that our future tax rate increases, which include funding for both operational and high school project financing, are projected to stay under the Cost of Living Act 1 inflationary index. Our historical look does show that the average cost of living tax increase for operational needs has averaged about 2% a year for the last 13 plus years. And as projected, the next several years are likely to include an incremental difference of 0.9 to 1.4% attributed to the most significant capital investment the district will make in the next 50 to 100 years. Yet all tax increases are still projected to remain under the cost of living inflationary index. To summarize, the 2023-2024 budget includes a 2.9% or 0.5910 mil increase in real estate taxes, which is less than the Act 1 inflationary index of 4.1% permitted by law. The owners of a $200,000 home would pay approximately $9.85 more per month in property taxes. This budget includes set-asides to build capacity for the high school project, and all future tax rate increases for both operational and capital needs, including the new high school, are projected to stay under the inflationary Act 1 indexes of the future. Quaker Valley's tax rate and our taxing effort relative to market values remain in the lowest third in Allegheny County. I am happy to recommend the 2023-2024 budget for adoption. Thank you for your time and attention.